Okay, good morning, everybody. Hi, my name is Sarah Ladislaw. I am the Director of the Energy and National Security Program here at CSIS, and welcome to, I think, it's our program's first official event back after the summer holiday, so I hope you had a nice break and have sent your kids off to school. Today we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the upcoming UNFCCC climate negotiations in Paris that'll take place at the end of this year, and specifically do a little bit of stock taking in terms of the intended nationally determined contributions or the pledges that different countries have put forward. Now that we are less than 100 days away, we've got about 59 parties that have pledged their action towards the climate negotiations. We will talk a little bit about expectations for the negotiations themselves, but one of the things that we wanted to do, especially in preparing for some of the work we'd like to do after the Paris conference, is to try and think about what countries have put on the table and how we will think about what those pledges and contributions mean, both in terms of success for the negotiations, but also what the process for following up on those things will be for life post-Paris. And so we're very pleased to have with us today Elliot Diringer, who's the Executive Vice President at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES, as many of you know it, who is just back from Bonn, soon to go back to Bonn, not too soon. And we'll start us off by giving an overview of the INDCs, the process itself, the INDCs submitted thus far, and a little bit on the monitoring, review, and verification process, and some of the issues that are within the negotiations. And then also Joe Aldy, who is an associate professor of the Public Policy School at the Harvard Kennedy School at Harvard University, and also a senior advisor here with the CSIS Energy and National Security Program, who's going to talk a little bit about some work that he's got underway thinking about comparability, right? How should we assess these INDCs relative to one another? How should we be thinking about that? A big topic here in the United States, right? Every time we've got someone releasing a pledge, we think about it whether it's ambitious enough or how it relates to what the U.S. is doing. And so we're going to talk about some of those issues today. Each speaker will have a presentation, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion. We are being webcast live today, so everything is on the record. So without further ado, Elliot, you're up. Here you go. You just use the arrows.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Good morning to everyone. Pleasure to be here in this lovely new facility, my first opportunity. Congratulations on that. So as Sarah said, what I'm going to do is provide a bit of the context. And I'll start with a little bit of the history on the international climate regime, then talk about what we see emerging for Paris, the type of agreement I think we'll likely see come out of Paris, and then focus a little more closely on the role of transparency in this new agreement, and we'll close with some thoughts on what I think Paris can really accomplish. I think as my first point, and I'm sorry if some of the details there are a little hard to read, that's fine, because the basic point I'd like to make here is that we've been at this for quite a while. We started back in 1992 with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The U.S., of course, is a party to the convention, was signed by the first President Bush and ratified by the U.S. Senate. And we've learned a lot over the last couple of decades in trying to build on the convention. From the start, there's been a certain tension between two different models of climate governance. We talk about a spectrum, top-down at one end, bottom-up at the other end. You see both of those notions reflected in the convention itself, and in the course of the evolution of the regime over the last 20 years or so, parties have sort of veered in different directions. First, with the Kyoto Protocol, the regime went more in a top-down direction. Kyoto established binding economy-wide emission targets for developed countries only. So there you see a strong legal and technical rigor and just a more top-down type model. As we all know, Kyoto didn't really take off the way people had hoped. And when the second round of targets was negotiated under Kyoto, some of the countries chose not to stay in. And the U.S., of course, chose from the start not to stay in. And what we saw emerging in parallel under the convention was another track. Another framework, which was a more bottom-up approach. And this first emerged in 2009 at the Copenhagen Conference and was formalized a year later in Cancun. And here, rather than binding targets of a particular type, you have a framework that allows countries to take on any kind of pledge they want, and it's voluntary. So a very different approach. And in fact, what you saw was a lot broader participation. We now have probably close to 100 countries with pledges for 2020 under this Copenhagen-Cancun framework. But when you add up all those pledges, they're still not nearly enough to put us on path to keeping warming below 2 degrees, the internationally agreed goal. So we now have experience with both with a more top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. One, as I said, provides stronger rigor, but has seen shrinking participation under the Kyoto Protocol. Right now, targets encompass only about 13% of global emissions. And on the other hand, you have a bottom-up approach that achieves much broader participation, but still weak goals. Bottom line really is that neither of these approaches has really delivered the kind of effort that we need to meet the climate challenge. So what we see emerging for Paris is what we've called a hybrid approach, something that combines top-down elements with bottom-up elements to try to strike a balance between, on the one hand, some national flexibility to bring countries in, and on the other hand, some international rigor or discipline to ensure accountability and ambition. So that's really the objective here, is to achieve both broad participation and strong ambition. Now, we've seen this, let me just introduce to you the formal framing of this round of negotiations that's underway. This was agreed in 2011 at the Durban conference. Parties adopted what was called the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action. And what it calls for, what Paris is supposed to deliver, is a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force under the convention applicable to all parties. So that phrase is really the mandate to the parties, what they're supposed to produce. It leaves a lot of room to figure out what that really means concretely. Not a lot of strong guidance there. But the agreement's supposed to be delivered at the end of this year in Paris and will apply from 2020 on. You've probably read that the progress in the negotiations is very slow, and that's true. I mean, what we see is the formal negotiating process, but that's really just only the most visible dimension of the ongoing negotiations. The conversations are taking place at many different levels, including higher political levels, and we see strong convergence at those levels, despite the slow pace of the formal negotiations. We also see strong convergence emerging from a dialogue process that we, C2ES, convened over the last year and a half. We brought together senior negotiators from more than 20 countries in 8 sessions. Nearly 100 hours in all of discussions. This was a Chatham House rule discussion to give them an opportunity to really talk in a small group candidly about what the issues are, what the options are, and begin to see if some common ground might emerge from that discussion. We released a report from the co-chairs of that process back in July, and I think it actually does a very good job of sketching out the landing zones for Paris, the sweet spots on most of the major issues. Actually, we have copies of that out by on the sign-up table. But what really has been striking to me since we issued that report is to see many of those same ideas reflected in the summaries that have emerged from some ministerial level discussions. Very recent discussions. In fact, we were invited to present this report from the dialogue to the most recent meeting of the Major Economies Forum that was held in Luxembourg, co-hosted by the United States and Luxembourg. And you can look at the summary that came out of that meeting, as well as the summary that came out of another ministerial meeting hosted by the French and Peruvian governments just a few days later. Both of them reflect this growing convergence that I'm talking about. And first, I think this notion of a hybrid approach comes across very strongly. People are looking at an agreement that allows countries considerable flexibility in defining their own national contributions, but that's complemented by a set of rules and norms to strengthen accountability and ambition. The convergence also suggests that we're going to be moving beyond the traditional bifurcation of responsibilities between developed and developing countries toward a more nuanced approach toward differentiation under the regime. So one that's really determined more by countries' self-differentiation in determining their own contributions rather than based on categories of countries. And if we pull that off, and I'm pretty confident we will, that will actually be a major historic shift in the global climate regime. People also envision that this framework will need to continue building ambition over time. It's pretty well understood that the numbers that will be on the table by the time of Paris still aren't going to add up sufficiently to put us on that 2-degree pathway. So people are looking at a system that would require countries to come back to the table on a periodic basis, probably every 5 years, to take stock of where we are and to update their national contributions. With that, it would be a clear expectation of what people are referring to as no backsliding or forward progression. Once you've put forward a certain type or level of commitment, there's no going back. The expectation is in the next round, you're going to go further. Also, a lot of emphasis in this negotiation on stronger emphasis on adaptation. I'm not going to get into that, and obviously finance is always an issue, so the agreement is going to have to provide stronger support to help developing countries that need the help, both to reduce their emissions and to adapt to climate change. Also seeing very strong convergence on the role of transparency in this new framework. And transparency would be one of the top-down elements in this hybrid approach. We talk about 2 different types of transparency, ex ante and ex post. And ex ante refers to the information that countries put forward with their intended contributions ahead of the agreement so that everyone has a chance to look them over, understand what countries are proposing to do, and to be able to assess both their adequacy and their fairness relative to one another. The thinking also is that by encouraging countries to come forward early, not just with their targets, but also with good information about their targets, that will actually encourage countries to put their best foot forward, to come forward with the strongest possible effort. Then there's ex post transparency, and this is retrospective. Once countries have begun implementing their contributions, this would require them to be reporting on an ongoing basis on their progress in actually implementing their contributions. This allows us to assess where we are collectively, how countries are doing individually. It also is a good opportunity for some policy learning among countries. I've heard a lot of negotiators from developed countries in particular say that when they have had expert teams come and review their progress, it's been an enormously helpful process to better understand some of the challenges they're meeting and some of the ways to overcome those challenges. So those are the 2 fundamental types of transparency we're looking at, understanding contributions as they're coming forward and looking back and getting a good sense of really how countries are doing in implementing them. Focusing first more closely on ex ante transparency. Back in Warsaw, a couple of COPs ago, COP19, parties were invited to come forward with their intended nationally determined contributions. I haven't used the acronym INDC yet, but that's the acronym we use. And they were asked to do that in a manner that facilitates the clarity, transparency, and understanding of the intended contributions. So there was an expectation established that we want good information so we understand what it is you're putting on the table. The next year in Lima, some parties had hoped to establish a process within the UNFCCC to systematically look at what countries are coming forward and provide some collective assessment of that. Parties couldn't agree on that. The Lima decision did spell out the types of information that parties may include with their INDC, so this is not a requirement, it's more of a suggestion or an expectation. They were told that it would be good to have some quantifiable information on your reference points or your base year, the time frame for implementation, is it 2025, is it 2030, the scope and coverage, what gases are you reducing, is it economy-wide, is it sectoral, and your methodologies, particularly on how you're accounting for your emissions. It was also suggested that parties say how they consider their INDC to be fair and ambitious, and how it contributes to the ultimate goal of the convention, which is to stabilize greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at a level that avoids dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So those were the expectations set. In addition, the parties tasked the UNFCCC Secretariat with producing a report by October 1st of this year on the aggregate effect of the INDCs, basically adding them all up and seeing where they put us relative to a 2-degree pathway. So we didn't get any process to look at individual intended contributions, and what we're winding up with instead are ad hoc assessments. Individual parties are doing their own assessments of what they see others putting forward. They're not necessarily sharing those with anyone. That's for their own edification. But others in the NGO community and the academic community are also undertaking their own analyses and sharing those, and I think that's what we'll be hearing from Joe. In terms of what countries have come forward with in the INDCs to date, you see tremendous diversity. As I said back in the Kyoto Times, there was a single type of commitment that you could take. It was an absolute economy-wide reduction target, or actually, in some cases, a growth target, but an absolute economy-wide emissions target. So far, we have 31 NDCs submitted, and because the EU's covers 28 countries, that represents a total of 58 countries and about 70% of global CO2 emissions. All of those NDCs set some kind of emissions target. Most of them are economy-wide. 16 of them are absolute reduction targets. 2 of them are intensity-based, in other words, reductions of emissions relative to GDP, and 13 are what we call BAU targets. They are reductions from projected business as usual. So 3 very different types of targets here. All except 2 are set for 2030. The U.S. is one of the exceptions, which has set its target for 2025. 8 of the INDCs so far are either partly or fully conditional, either on receiving finance, and these are NDCs from developing countries, so either on receiving finance or on the availability of market mechanisms. A number of them do indicate that they intend to use market mechanisms, and others that they might in the future. And just to note, a number of them also do include an adaptation component. That was a big fight in Lima, whether everyone should be required to put forward an adaptation component in addition to their mitigation component. It's strictly voluntary, and some have taken advantage of that opportunity. So, one thing we see is that the great flexibility offered through this INDC approach is helping to encourage participation, but at the same time, you get such a diversity of targets that it's very hard to compare them. Some of the metrics that countries are identifying in their own submissions to defend their contributions, to justify their fairness or adequacy, they talk about their share of global emissions, their per capita emissions, what annual decarbonization rate they're going to achieve, how this affects their carbon intensity, their per capita GDP. So you see a range of metrics that are being offered, but again, nothing systematic. Just as one illustration of some of the challenges in trying to get a sense of comparability, this looks at 4 countries, or 4 countries or groups of countries: the US, the EU, Japan, and Canada. And what it shows you is how the comparisons change depending on your reference point, the base year you use. So, Europe has put forward an INDC with a 1990 baseline. The other three are using a 2005 baseline. If you look at it based on 1990, Europe, the orange bar, it looks much more ambitious. If you look at it against a 2005 baseline, they begin to equalize somewhat. Interesting, though, if you look at it against a 2013 baseline, basically today, those numbers look roughly comparable. Now, people can put forward arguments as to why one baseline or the other might be the right one, and I'm not suggesting that any of these is the right one. This is just an illustration of how the appearance of comparability depends very much on the lens you're looking through. So jumping forward then to ex post transparency, there is a lot that already exists under the UNFCCC to address ex post transparency. The important point is, though, that it's very bifurcated. All of the requirements are differentiated based on developed and developing countries. So you have national communications, you have emissions inventories, you have biennial reports, you have different forms of review, but they're basically two parallel systems with very different requirements for developed and developing countries. I think what we're looking at in the Paris Agreement, and this draws on the dialogue report that we produced, is transitioning toward a common system, moving beyond this bifurcated approach, developing a common framework for reporting and review. It would need to have some flexibility built into it because countries have very different capacities. You'd need to accommodate that somehow. You could have self-selected tiers based either on different levels of capacity or on different types of contributions, and countries could choose which tier to be part of. But the expectation would be that over time, everyone's working toward the same standard of transparency. Let me just offer some few closing thoughts, stepping back and thinking about where we are and where Paris might take us. Those of you who've followed this process for a long time might note or might actually share some deep cynicism in many quarters about what the UNFCCC process can produce. And as someone who's watched that process very closely for a long time, I understand the roots of that cynicism. At the same time, I worry that cynicism may blind us to some genuine opportunities we have in Paris. I noticed a headline on a BBC story this morning, will the new climate treaty be a nothing burger? I think there's a good chance for it to be something more than a nothing burger. I'm encouraged because, for one thing, I see a much greater sense of realism among countries. In the wake of Copenhagen, which was widely viewed as a failure, I think countries have a much more pragmatic sense of what this process can deliver, and also a clearer understanding that this process itself can't be expected to produce the full solution. It's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. And as I noted earlier, we're seeing strong convergence emerging at the political level. In fact, we are much further ahead of where we were leading into Copenhagen in terms of having a common understanding of the basic paradigm we're working toward. The question, I think, at the end of the day is, will the agreement be additive? Will it produce more action than it would without an agreement? And I think I have pretty strong confidence that the answer will be yes. I think we're already seeing that the process of encouraging countries to come forward with INDCs is, in fact, catalyzing national action. I think it has forced countries to undertake internal debates to figure out what it is they can do, and they're doing more than they otherwise would have been. But I think we have a chance here to establish a much more balanced and more durable framework, moving us beyond this sort of splintered, bifurcated approach, something that can get all of the major players on board, provide for some decent accountability, and hopefully work to build ambition over time. Bottom line, I think this is about building confidence. I think this is an exercise in strengthening confidence, both in our own ability to address the issue, but also confidence that others are contributing their fair share to the overall effort. And the more confidence we have that they are, the more each country can bring to the table in the next round. So that's my hope. It's perhaps a modest or limited hope, but I think it's achievable, and I think it'll make a difference. So I will stop there.
Great.
Thanks.
Okay, next we're going to move to Joe, who's going to try and take sort of the flip side of, I think, a tension that Elliot pointed out, which is that flexibility makes it easy for people to participate, but perhaps harder for the rest of us to figure out how comparable one country's actions is to another. So, Joe.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for hosting this, and to your colleagues here at CSIS for making this event happen. It's a real pleasure to be on the panel today with Elliot. He indicated that he's been working on this issue for a long time. It was almost, I'm afraid to say, 2 decades ago when we were working on this issue together in the Clinton administration, where I had more hair and it was darker, and Elliot's hair was probably darker then too. And one of the side effects of working on international climate policy is it'll have that kind of impact on us. In my remarks here today, I think I'm going to echo and complement a lot of what Elliot has said. I think we are seeing this kind of evolution that is much more pragmatic in the international negotiations, that is much more realistic, that is really trying to focus on what is achievable and moving away from what may be sort of first best, what may be desirable or even aspirational, but is inconsistent, I think, with domestic politics in many countries. And I think the emerging process that Elliot described is one that I think is much more consistent with what is feasible in terms of domestic implementation, which is critical because at the end of the day, the changes that are going to occur in reducing emissions globally will be a result of the actions that are being taken in capitals and national governments, as well as those at the subnational level. In my remarks, I want to focus a little bit on the role of transparency, and some of this I'm going to draw from some of the academic literature that I think provides a really strong foundation for some of the arguments that Elliot made about how transparency can build trust and confidence in an international climate agreement. I'm then going to spend a majority of my time focusing on the role of comparability. What does it mean to actually compare effort, mitigation effort across countries? How might we go about doing that? What are the information needs, the analytic needs necessary to do that? And how can that hopefully inform the kind of ratcheting up over time, the enhancement of ambition over time that I think we want to see in the international climate policy framework? And then I'll close with a few comments about the implications for the international negotiations. So first, to the role of transparency. I would say, if you were to ask an academic what best characterizes the climate change problem, there's probably a lot of different terms that they'll throw at you, but you would hear from many of them the challenge of uncertainty. And that's certainly the case when we look at trying to assess what countries are doing, or at least what they say they're going to do, in terms of mitigating their emissions. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about whether or not a commitment put forward is credible. Some of that may be because of past experience. For example, some countries look at the United States and say, in 1997 at the Kyoto Conference, you said you were going to reduce emissions 7%, and then you did not ratify the agreement, and your emissions did not fall below 7% during that first commitment period because you weren't party to the Kyoto Protocol. So there's sort of uncertainty about whether or not countries will deliver on their commitments. There's uncertainty about how effective their policies may be. There's also uncertainty in how well we can actually observe the performance of a country. And I think that's becoming more and more important when we look at the increasing heterogeneity in the kinds of contributions that countries are putting on the table. We're not just looking at total emissions for a country, and there's a question about whether or not we can adequately monitor that, but we're looking at emissions relative to a forecast or emissions relative to GDP, or in some cases, characteristics of energy policies, such as having a fraction of your energy coming from zero carbon resources. There's also the thing that I think is important to recognize, that there may be exogenous shocks that affect the ability of a country, even if it's trying to implement a good faith climate policy, to deliver on what it originally said it was going to do. I think a prime example of this is Japan because of the Fukushima disaster. This was a country whose plan to reduce CO2 emissions, a country which, by the way, already was relatively lean in using energy, relatively lean in terms of carbon per unit of GDP among developed countries. Their plan long-term was to really ramp up nuclear power until the 2011 Fukushima disaster. That obviously has created a very intensive debate in Japan about the future of nuclear and has, I think, important implications for what is feasible for them domestically. But it's also important to think about what role economic shocks might have in the ability of a country to deliver on its commitment. In some cases, it may make it easier for a country to deliver on its commitment if it suffers from a decline in economic activity or slower than expected economic growth. I think this is important when we look at, say, for example, Russia. If you just looked at emissions, and you looked at the countries that committed to targets in Kyoto, Russia looks like the world leader on climate change. If you actually looked at their policies to reduce emissions, it wouldn't take you long to realize there's not much there. And it's basically because their economy has not grown as fast as we anticipated at the time that we negotiated the targets at the Kyoto Conference in 1997. And because of the economic transformation, the shutting down of a lot of the energy-intensive manufacturing, their emissions from the early 90s through today have stayed 30 to 40% below their 1990 levels. I think an important thing when we think about the role of transparency is signaling. And there's literature that goes all the way back to Tom Schelling, the Nobel laureate, in the 1950s, reflecting in part on his real-world experience negotiating the Marshall Plan, negotiating NATO, that at times, if you're going to really be credible and you're going to demonstrate credibility, you need to be very public in what you say you're going to do, and you need to establish public measures by which someone can evaluate you. By taking advantage of that transparency and the publicity, you're then raising the cost or failing to deliver on what you said you were going to do. And this has actually spawned a long literature in game theory, in international relations, and in international law about how you can impose costs on future political leaders by being public now about what you intend to do, even if you're not imposing anything that one might call legally binding on those future political leaders. In a sense, it's this kind of publicity that can facilitate the naming and shaming that might drive leaders and drive governments to doing more than what they would have done otherwise, even though at the end of the day, they could do nothing and face no real direct repercussions. But it's that kind of political fallout, that public fallout, that serves as motivation, and actually in some countries can effectively motivate and mobilize domestic stakeholders to ensure that their government lives up on what they pledged to do previously. Third, I'd note that there are important incentives for monitoring, and this gets to some of the discussion that Elliot had on MRV, is that the incentives for countries to defect from an agreement, or to free ride as we typically describe it, will create incentives for others to monitor them. So given that we have this global public goods problem with climate change, given that there's a strong incentive for a country to say, I'm going to do a lot in reducing my emissions, and then hold off and let everyone else do more because you can benefit from their actions in reducing emissions, that creates a strong incentive for us to look at each other and make sure that we're actually delivering on our commitments. And as we actually work to design institutions that allow us to detect when a country is failing to deliver on its commitments, that actually makes it more likely that countries are assured that everyone else is moving together. So if the U.S. is concerned about whether, say, its trade partners are taking comparable ambitious actions, if you have a credible system of monitoring, the U.S. can look to its left and its right and see that its peers are moving in lockstep with them. The existence of a rigorous system of monitoring also makes it less likely that a country that might think about defecting from its agreement would decide to do so, because they realize now it's more likely they'll be caught, and it's more likely they'll face the cost politically and the repercussions diplomatically of failing to deliver on their commitments. And so in total, I think when one looks at this experience in the literature, when one looks at the experience in other international contexts that I'll comment on in a moment, having a system of transparency can help build credibility and trust, as Elliot noted in his remarks. For one thing, we should recognize that because of what we hope to be the repeated nature of these negotiations, Paris is not the end, it's really the beginning of what we hope will be an iterative process of countries pledging what they can do in terms of mitigating emissions, providing information about how they're going to be implementing their mitigation plans, a process by which we will be able to review and assess if countries are delivering on that, and then using that to inform the next round of pledges and contributions. By having that kind of process, it's going to be important that we have a system of policy surveillance, system of transparency, so that countries, when they go through the next iteration, are working with a common evidentiary basis for who delivered or who failed to deliver on that previous round of contributions. I think it's important to recognize that if we're able to sustain cooperation globally, we're going to need this kind of effective monitoring, and recognizing that this is going to facilitate reciprocity that over time can ensure that as countries take a step together, they look at whether or not everyone delivered previously, they're more likely to take a second, more ambitious step together, and so on as we try to tackle this problem. Now, I think there are some important lessons we can draw from other international or multilateral agreements. This isn't the first time we've tried to design a system of review, a system of data collection and analysis. We've seen this in a variety of contexts, whether it's through the International Monetary Fund and their Article 4 consultations. The World Trade Organization has the Trade Policy Review Mechanism. The OECD has economic surveys of its member states. The Montreal Protocol, I think, has a better data collection and review process than we've seen to date historically under the UN Framework Convention, and even under arms control agreements and trade in endangered species. So let me note a couple of key lessons when we look at these other agreements. First is the credibility of information, which typically requires us to delegate to third-party experts. So it's not kind of a bilateral review, although I agree with Elliot, we are going to see countries doing their own assessments of the mitigation contributions that they're seeing submitted through the INDC process. But finding professional experts, for example, professional staff at the IMF or the WTO or the OECD, to actually collect data, to work with a country who will provide a report, and to conduct analysis for that. They can then provide this as an input into a peer review process. And we have sort of a nascent peer review process right now in the UNFCCC. But I think there's some important lessons when we look at the peer review process in the IMF, in the WTO, and the OECD, which is really facilitative in nature. This isn't trying to figure out who's failing to deliver and who's not. We're trying to understand why countries are realizing the outcomes they are. And there may be opportunities to learn from each other, which can be really important, as Elliot noted as well. I think as we see countries start to implement policies to mitigate their emissions, we're going to really learn what are the most effective policies at reducing emissions, especially in different economic or development contexts, where right now there may not be much evidence and much historical experience. So being able to use this kind of transparency mechanism can help facilitate this learning that allows us to ramp up ambition, especially as more and more emerging economies and developing economies look for enhancing their contributions down the line. When we think about the ways in which we implement policy surveillance, and you look at the experience in these other international organizations, they've actually done a lot to build up capacity within national governments. As they pull together their data, as they conduct their own analysis that's consistent with the process under the IMF and under the WTO, and it enhances the quality of work that they're doing within their finance, economic, and planning ministries. It's important to recognize as well that we don't have to do one-size-fits-all. This is the kind of concern that some countries raise in the context of MRV and related transparency mechanisms under the UNFCCC. For example, under the WTO, the frequency of a review is a function of your share of world trade. So if you're one of the biggest players in world trade, you're reviewed every 2 years. If you're sort of a middle country in terms of your share of world trade, you're reviewed every 4 years. But the majority of the members of the WTO are only reviewed every 6 years. So one can imagine something analogous, say, to your share of global emissions that might motivate the frequency with which you're reviewed under the UNFCCC. And finally, I think what we've seen in these other contexts is that there can be an important role for civil society. They can serve as a way of providing input into the analysis. They can play an external role of reviewing the reviewers. They may be able to develop novel methods and approaches to evaluating how countries' mitigation actions are being implemented that can inform the task of those who are officially implementing the reviews. And in some cases, they've even been tasked with doing the reviews. For example, under CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So there are a variety of roles that civil society can play, and I think that's important in light of what Elliot noted in terms of the fact that we have this kind of voluntary process right now in the sort of ex-ante stage of review in which countries can voluntarily put forward information, but we don't have a formal institutional structure within the UNFCCC for evaluating, assessing, and comparing what countries are putting on the table. And we're seeing a number of groups from academia, as well as stakeholders and NGOs, who are starting to do that analysis, and I think that will help inform the debate as we go to Paris, but hopefully help us shape the way we should implement a transparency regime beyond Paris. Let me now comment some about the role of comparability of effort. So the question is sort of why should we think about comparing effort? And my sense is the first question that everyone's going to ask about Paris, the question they're already asking, many of them are already answering it, will we deliver on 2 degrees C? And my sense is we already know the answer. We've known the answer for every COP since Berlin in 1995, even though we didn't have a 2 degree C goal back then. But the answer is no, it's not enough. I don't think that's a very interesting question because we already know the answer. To me, the more interesting question is the question that's really begged by that answer of no, it's, well, who can do more? And if you're really trying to get a sense of, well, who can do more, we're going to have to do a serious assessment of what countries are pledging to do. And we're going to have to think through ways in which we're going to compare what countries are doing. Now, one can look at a very long literature, as well as in the past submissions by various countries to the UNFCCC on what I would describe as sort of a normative or ethical approach to burden sharing. As a function of historic emissions, as a function of per capita emissions, maybe as a function of per capita income, we should be deciding what countries should be doing. And what we found is countries really don't like to be told what they should be doing. And that's why I think we've seen this evolution towards more of a bottom-up, sort of sovereign assessment of what a country thinks it can do in light of its domestic political economy. And instead, and the approach that my colleague Billy Pizer and I have been focusing on is something that's much more facilitative, which is how can we think about a process and a framework for comparing mitigation effort that's truly facilitative, that can support cooperation, that can improve the information base and the evidentiary basis for the negotiations so that we can enhance ambition over time. Now, in some of our work, we've liked to quote the Nobel laureate Lynn Ostrom, who noted in a lot of her work looking at common pool resources and public goods that are more local in nature. But we think this is equally applicable to countries that are negotiating as it is in the more local context that she focused on in her scholarship. And she notes, this probably isn't that surprising, I think my 3-year-old is starting to get this even at his daycare, is that individuals tend to react to the positive actions of others with positive responses, and the negative actions of others with negative responses. Or for my 3-year-old, that's called sharing or not sharing. So the idea is sort of, if we're able to see each other taking positive actions, that's going to make it more likely that we're going to reciprocate with even more ambitious actions down the line. Now, the big question is how are countries going to be able to judge and ascertain whether or not another country or another party is undertaking positive or negative or insufficient action? And I think it's important to recognize different countries and different parties are going to judge each other differently. They're going to bring their own ethical approaches to this. And so some may look at what a country is doing and saying that's not enough, whereas another country may say, no, that's fine. And I think a lot of this is going to depend on a country's own domestic politics, the nature of their leadership, on how they approach this. But if we're going to do this, I think it's important to think through the metrics by which we can inform this debate on whether or not a country is doing enough. So in some of our work, we've thought through what might be sort of reasonable principles for metrics for how you would compare action. And this is not something that's unique to what we're doing, but in a lot of work that tries to assess performance. There's ideas on sort of, well, what are the best ways for assessing performance, whether it's in business, whether it's in, implementation of domestic public policy. But we thought there's sort of 3 basic principles that should inform these metrics. The first is that ideally you'd want your metric to be comprehensive, that it really captures the notion of effort. Is a country doing something different than it would have otherwise that's reducing its emissions? It's not just an accident that economic growth is not as fast as we anticipated, like in the case of Russia since the 1990s, but that they're actually really undertaking meaningful changes to their policies that's helping to change the trajectory of their emissions. And a really well-designed comprehensive metric should then say that 2 comparable countries, say the US and, if you will, a region, the EU, are taking sort of similar values on a given metric. One might say, well, that means there's fairness here. That, of course, is raising questions about how they approach fairness, but that might be one way to interpret this. The second is that they ought to be measurable and replicable. So ideally, your metrics should be directly observable, or they could be based on transparent analysis. So really understand how the metric is calculated. It's not subject to a bunch of different assumptions where there may be credible differences in those assumptions. And finally, we'd want the metric to be universal. We'd want it to really be applied to as broad a set of countries as possible, because we are in this effort now under the Durban platform to expand the set of countries participating in the mitigation effort. So let me give some examples of metrics, and I'll give it in sort of three categories. And the first one that's the most natural is emissions, in part because we can think of different ways in which countries have structured their contributions are emissions-based. So we can think about emissions relative to a base year, and Elliot described some of the proposals or pledges from developed countries where they've chosen different base years. There are a number of countries that have proposed emissions relative to a forecast, business as usual. We have several countries that have put forward emissions as a function of GDP. Part of the China INDC has a carbon intensity goal along these lines. And there are some who argue that in evaluating the fairness, and I would argue this should be used as a benchmark, which I'll return to at the end of my talk, as a benchmark for comparing countries, have argued that we should be looking at per capita emissions. Now, there's some pros and cons, of course, to using emissions. One is it's directly observable. That's pretty good. If we think of it as being associated with the environmental outcome, that's good, although there's a lot of other factors that can dictate aggregate emissions in an economy that may be completely unrelated to mitigation policies, and so there may be some meaningful noise in that measure. If it's measurable relative to history, that may have some appeal because we're able to see how much progress a country has made over the 2+ decades since the Rio Earth Summit. There is a concern, of course, that the best notion of effort may be best measurable when we think about emissions relative to a forecast, but we may see different people disagreeing about what's the right way to forecast for a country. And especially for some developing countries where you could have a significant variation in credible forecasts for that country. I mean, I think back to a lot of the forecasting that was done for China at the beginning of the last decade. You know, the EIA and the IEA both were forecasting China's emissions out to 2010, and they were dramatically underestimating China's emissions. And in fact, by 2004, China had reached what had been forecast for them by 2010. And part of this is just because we didn't have great data. We thought that the significant improvements in energy intensity in the 90s was going to continue through the aughts. But in the end, we actually saw China's emissions grow much, much faster than we thought in 2000. And their emissions wound up being a couple of gigatons higher than was forecast just a few years earlier. So there are a lot of questions about how well we can actually do these forecasts, which might be a better, if we can do a good forecast, would probably be a better measure of mitigation effort than simply what's your emissions level. Certainly if you were to look at, say, Russia, their mitigation effort looks much smaller relative to what people forecast for Russia than what they are relative to the historic base year 1990 emissions. The second measure is prices, and we can think about carbon prices or we could just think about energy prices. Now, this has some appeal because this is starting to look at what are going to be the domestic policies implemented by a country as a part of its program under its contribution. We could be looking at energy prices which are quite transparent, quite observable in the economies. In countries that have either carbon tax or cap and trade programs, the carbon price will be fairly transparent as well. We could look at the absolute levels and compare them across countries, or we could look at changes over time. So it's really appealing as a measure of effort. You're doing something different. If you didn't have a carbon price before, and now you have a carbon price, that's a clear sign you're doing something different, something that you would not have done otherwise if it were not for your climate mitigation program. The market prices are observable, and they really reflect the signals for what we really need, which is the innovation in new technologies, the deployment of low-carbon technologies that will eventually lower emissions over the long term. Now, there are some challenges with this. A lot of countries may implement policies to reduce emissions that don't yield a direct or explicit carbon price. So, for example, how would you think about fuel economy standards in the United States in a framework in which you're trying to compare prices? We're not going to have an implicit carbon price through the implementation of fuel economy standards. There may also be challenges in how you compare a carbon price in one country that may be measured in euros, another in RMB, another in dollars, and so on, when we think about market exchange rates. Finally, let me comment on a third category of metrics, which are cost. And these could be absolute cost or relative to the size of your economy, relative to GDP. You could estimate it for the actual policies being implemented. There are some who argue you ought to be estimating it on sort of a least cost implementation of your economy-wide target. And that way, if you were to do it on least cost implementation, it has the appeal of saying, here is what we think your cost would be if you really took advantage of the most cost-effective ways of reducing emissions. It also has the appeal, if you talk to the modeling community, they can do that. Actually, modeling real-world policies, especially given the number and complexity of these policies, is much tougher for a lot of those in the modeling community. Now, one appeal for cost is it really does reflect effort. Another appeal for cost is, for a lot in terms of the domestic politics, this is what really matters. What are our costs relative to, say, the costs that are being borne by manufacturing in China or manufacturing in other trade partners? This is something that will, I think, resonate in the U.S. Domestic politics. The challenge with cost, of course, is we don't directly observe these. We're going to need modeling tools in order to estimate cost. And there's a concern that if you were to say, well, let's develop a really rich model that can really characterize each of the policies being implemented in a country, you might show some countries have high cost because they're implementing fairly ineffective policies. We don't want to say that's a good thing. We want to be able to learn from policies and identify those that appear to be most cost effective through this kind of process. So in sum, we found that there's not a single metric that sort of satisfies our principles or criteria for the design of metrics. It's clear that countries are going to prefer one metric or another that I think will reflect their negotiating position and try to give them more influence in the course of the negotiations. It may be a challenge to actually reach a consensus. Elliot referenced that in Lima we could not reach a consensus on how we should structure the ex-ante analysis. And it's not clear to me that in Paris we're going to reach a really meaningful consensus on how we could conduct the assessments and use that information for comparing mitigation contributions across countries. So in the end, we recommend using a suite of metrics. I think one is likely to see this happen anyway when countries do their own bilateral assessments. When I was in the US government, we had a number of video conferences with the EU where we would go over about 4 or 5 different metrics and talk about sort of the similarity in what we were putting on the table in the run-up to Copenhagen to what they were putting on the table. So in the end, I think, though, this isn't sort of foreign to us. We've seen this in other contexts. When we talk about the health of the macroeconomy, we don't look at just one number. We'll look at a suite of metrics. We'll look at GDP. We'll look at the unemployment rate, the inflation rate, interest rates. Likewise, we should be looking at a suite of metrics and assessing the contributions that countries are putting on the table. And one way to sort of think about this, though, is how might we illustrate both an ex-ante review and an ex-post review the use of these metrics. I apologize, the coloring doesn't come up here very well, but to sort of show for these sort of 3 categories, for emissions, price, and cost, what kind of analytic and data requirements are called for when looking at, for example, China versus the US and the EU. And I've grouped the US and the EU together because the fact that they have similarly structured commitments or contributions, the data and analytic requirements are the same. So if we're trying to look at emissions relative to a historic base year, that's directly observed for those countries. In contrast, for China, we're going to have to do some modeling to assess what their 2030 peak year / carbon intensity / zero carbon share of the energy production elements of their INDC, what that would actually mean in practice. For other of the emission metrics, we're looking at it relative to a future year like 2025 or 2030. If we're looking at changes in emissions intensity over time, we're going to need some kind of forecast. And if we're going to look at prices and cost ex ante, we're going to need modeling for all the countries. And I think that's one thing that's important, that given the heterogeneity and contributions now, I think it is going to place more and more demands for this kind of analysis in order to assess even just the emissions that will go into the work that the Secretariat has to do to assess the aggregate effect of INDCs, and I think inform the process on what's going to be the impact on the global climate of what countries are putting on the table. But that analysis, I think, can go a lot further and help us understand who's doing more or less and how we sort of weight that in the negotiations. For ex-post review, the nature of the work is going to be common across countries. For some things, we'll be able to directly observe, whether it's changes in emissions or emissions intensity. For some things, such as relative to a forecast business as usual, even ex post, we're going to have a counterfactual for what we think would have happened in the absence of that country's climate mitigation program. So there'll still be modeling requirements for that. For looking at carbon prices, especially for countries that don't use explicitly carbon pricing domestic policies, we're also going to need modeling analysis for ex post to assess those metrics. And certainly on cost, whether it's ex ante or ex post, we're going to again need to have modeling tools to assess that. Finally, I should note that I think it's important now that we start planning for ex post review. And I think this is part of what's under consideration in the negotiations, but I think it's really critical. We're going to need to think through the data and analytic needs and actually start the process by which we collect those data in countries to inform the ex post review. I think we want to promote sort of advanced transparency of this ex post review and really think through the interim process for review, something that Elliot alluded to in his presentation. And I think it's also important for us to really use this ex post review to learn what's really effective and actually think through ways in which we can have rigorous statistical analysis to assess what policies are going to be most effective in reducing emissions in various countries and contexts. And finally, a couple of comments on the implications for negotiations. Let me note a caveat. I enjoy the luxury of being in the ivory tower now. I come down to DC and I spend like 6 or 8 hours and then I leave. And so with that information, you should take this perhaps with a grain of salt. So from my sort of view, a little more distant than it used to be from the process. One, I think that there are certainly those who express some frustration coming out of Lima that we didn't have a more structured process of countries putting information on the table, conducting analysis, having a formal assessment by experts, feeding into a peer review process. I think that's the kind of gold standard. I think that that's something that we've seen in many other multilateral contexts. So it's not, to me, out of the norm or out of the ordinary to say we should have a process like this if countries participate in that, if they are engaged in international trade under the WTO, or are, as almost every country in the world with the exception, I think maybe 2, are members of the IMF. Having said that, the fact that we have this kind of voluntary provision of data and analysis process, we're seeing this kind of heterogeneity in the characteristics of the INDCs that have been tabled so far, and I think we'll likely see as more come in over the course of the fall. It provides an opportunity. It provides an opportunity for us to learn through this variation, well, what information really matters? What may be the best ways to communicate this information? What may be the kind of detail about domestic implementation programs that we think would be really important to enhance both the credibility in the negotiations and inform those who need to conduct the analysis ex ante or are interested in conducting the analysis ex ante to assess whether a country's domestic program will deliver on its target. I mean, think about the difference between now and 1997. When Elliot and I were working in the government in 1997, it was about, maybe 6 weeks, 8 weeks before Kyoto, and the US government said, here's our goal. We're going to reduce emissions to 1990 levels by the year 2010. Something that we eventually negotiated down to 7% below 1990 during the Kyoto talks. And we said, we're going to invest $5 billion over 5 years in new energy technologies, and we're going to implement an economy-wide cap and trade program starting the year 2008. That was the extent of our description of the cap and trade program. We didn't have any more details figured out. Of course, you had the luxury you weren't going to be in office in 2008. But in contrast, now the US government has put on the table this minus 26 to minus 28% goal. It has described where emissions are in quite extensive details where they've declined since 2006, so almost a full decade now of decline. It's not just a recession. It's change in energy prices, but it's also an aggressive pushing out, especially in the power sector, of renewable technologies. It's pushing out fuel economy and appliance efficiency standards. So there's a lot that's been going on that's described, saying the Clean Power Plan is going to be a big part of it. And if someone from another government really wants to read the Clean Power Plan and the RIA, which is long, they will know in excruciating detail how the U.S. will implement the biggest single policy necessary to deliver on its 2025 goal. They'll be able to look at the complementary policies, whether it's on fuel economy standards out to 2025, what may be done on methane. So there's a very detailed domestic program, some of which is referenced in the INDC, but some of it is clearly evident when one looks at the program that's described by the administration. So there's a lot more information that people can work with now. And whether it's other countries evaluating whether or not what the U.S. has put on the table is truly credible in light of this domestic program, whether it's NGO experts or academics, there's a lot more to work with now to assess whether the U.S. INDC is credible. So I think we can learn and use this opportunity of variation in what's being put on the table to really figure out, well, what may be the most informative approach going forward in terms of the information that needs to be submitted, the kind of analysis that's submitted as a part of the INDCs. I think the big question is, how do we transition to what I think will be a necessary and more rigorous process that's institutionalized? You know, to me, the success of Paris is not, are we going to get to 2 degrees C or not? That's a long process. Even if we say we don't have enough now to get to 2 degrees C, we could do more in the future that actually keeps 2 degrees C on the table if we can really enhance ambition over time. The key thing is to actually build what I think will be a robust international policy architecture, to build the institutions that enhance credibility, that build trust, that really can facilitate the ramping of ambition over time. And so that's the question, is how do we think about integrating this kind of ex ante and ex post review that I think can help promote that kind of ramping up of ambition. The last thing I'll note is that I think there will be a lot of discussion of sort of what constitutes a fair contribution. So I've described some of these metrics, and in our work that Billy and I have done, and we're now engaging with some modelers, we've been kind of agnostic on what's the right way to weight one country versus another. And certainly there will be those who say, you ought to have some benchmarks. You got to think about how you compare countries. We want to get away from this bifurcation that Elliot referenced, of sort of we'll compare Annex 1 to non-Annex 1 countries. I think this is something that countries will just do on their own. And it'll be a function of their domestic politics. You know, the U.S. will look to certain countries and say, are they doing something comparable to us? Because we need to be able to assure our domestic stakeholders that they are. And I think that will be true in other countries as well. And they'll then identify potential benchmarks that might serve as the basis then for how they compare across those countries. Finally, I'll note, if you enter like reading long academic papers, there's a number here, a number of these here, which CSIS can either post on the website or circulate if you're interested, where we talk about comparability as well as transparency of mitigation effort. And thank you for joining us here today, and look forward to our discussion.
Great, thanks, Joe. Thanks very much. So I find that climate change discussions, especially the ones that are dealing with the negotiations, follow along 2 basic tracks. One is the huge amounts of sort of technical detail, right, that goes into the negotiations themselves, all the complexity of that. We put out a climate glossary several months ago, a colleague, Michelle Melton, and I here, just to try and understand some of that terminology and how it relates to the negotiations today, because if you haven't been doing this for 20 years, it can get kind of complex relatively quickly. And then there is sort of the larger theory of the case, right? You described it as, Elliot, as being sort of the evolution of a hybrid approach. Joe, yours was more of a description of sort of a positivity snowballing effect put forward by a Nobel laureate, which I think is great. The question for me is, for a lot of folks, it's very confusing to follow what the key metric is, right? And so maybe starting with you, Joe, if signaling is the key metric for driving greater ambition and participation right now, and yet you have all of these metrics, doesn't that make the signaling kind of muddy, right? And so I think about it from the perspective of all of the INDCs we've seen submitted so far this year. You can interpret them based on whatever metric you want to, right? So when the Chinese-US agreement came out in the early part of the year, there was probably an equally weighted number of people saying it was not ambitious as ambitious, right? And so figuring out how a country should feel beholden to an international process based on the fact that everybody's using their own numbers, how long is that durable, right? Like, how long can you do that and have effective signaling in sort of the post, Paris process? And then for you, Elliot, sort of a similar question. We've seen all of these INDCs come out. By your numbers, it was 31 submitted, 58 countries, 70% of global emissions, but I think maybe we had 90 countries submit for Copenhagen, right? What metric should we be using? How are people in the negotiations feeling about the number of INDCs being put forward, what they're putting on the table in terms of emissions reductions? What is the right metric for trying to assess whether or not the INDCs have sort of met their mark for what they're supposed to be? Is it about emissions reduction? Is it about participation? How should we be thinking about that? So maybe Joe and then Elliot.
So what's the key metric? I'm not sure. I think, one reason why I showed those two tables was to reflect the fact that I think there are a variety of metrics that can be informative. If you were to do an analysis of a country and say, okay, they have a carbon price, but there's no change in emissions, that should make you question what's going on. And some have expressed a concern that what you could see, and we've actually seen this some in the past, that a country might put on a carbon tax and simultaneously reduce taxes on its on energy and its economy. And so the net effect is that not change the price of energy. In fact, you have a number of northern European countries that have implemented a carbon tax, some dating back now 20 some odd years, and a couple of them did reduce their energy tax while imposing a carbon tax. Now, some of them face a pretty meaningful carbon tax, but there is this kind of concern about, well, could there be offsetting policies? So I think we care about looking at something that reflects real action on the ground in terms of policies. As I noted in the Kyoto days, no one talked about how they were going to implement their targets. I mean, the Europeans, if anything, were going to do a carbon tax, and they, were adamantly opposed to cap and trade at the Kyoto negotiations, and then over time, obviously, they changed their minds and have the world's largest cap and trade program. So you see this kind of learning process about how they can implement policies. And I think there's going to be value in trying to get down a little bit more into the weeds to say, not only here's the headline for what a country says its target's going to be, or its contribution is going to be, but how can we assess that to say, looking at their planned domestic program or what they already have going on, they can meaningfully get there. And I think that there are going to be some constituents who care a lot about, are they doing as much to reduce emissions as someone else? And so they'll care about something that best proxies the environmental outcome, and that would be emissions. But I think you also have business stakeholders in countries who care a lot about, wait, am I facing sort of a comparable policy impact, say a carbon price, or a regulatory requirement as my competitors in other, my business competitors in other countries? And so I think that's why we've expanded to look at not just emissions, but also these economic price and cost measures that I think better reflect this kind of effort and this deviation from what you would have done otherwise. Because that's what we need to do is change the policy landscape so countries are doing something that's different. So I think part of it is and this is, I think, a learning process in terms of how we might think about the transparency in the review, which is, let's start with a template, and let's see sort of what's the robust story you can tell from a set of metrics, and what may vary a lot from one metric to another. And so I thought it was interesting, the slide that Elliot put up saying, what you choose as your base year matters a lot. And we, that's something that we know, certainly when we had our back and forth with the EU in 2009, we knew that the choice of base year mattered a lot when trying to assess effort. So I think you want to look at a number of those metrics, figure out what's the robust story you can tell. And over time, as we start to do this analysis, we may learn that some measures are truly redundant of others, and so we can drop them from the table. And so ideally, you'd have something that is a fairly simple table by which you could look across countries and then assess sort of, are they doing comparable things? But I don't think there's a single metric now. But I think what's important when we think about if this is durable long-term is to have a sort of serious conversation about what's the information we want to produce and use in the negotiations that we want to sort of institutionalize, but have it in a way that we can adjust over time. I mean, I think it's the UNFCCC is not the leading example of good transparency and policy surveillance, and why I think we might be able to learn from what other multilateral organizations have done in improving what we do here.
So you're sort of asking, what's the threshold? How do we know we've got enough? And we've already said that whatever numbers are on the table by the time we get to Paris, we know it's not enough in terms of the atmospheric need, and that's a longer-term challenge. In terms of level of participation, what I would be looking for is that all of the major economies have numbers, have offered up their intended contributions. We're not quite there yet. But the fact that we had the US, the EU, and China out there as early as we did, I think is a very positive indication. We're still waiting on India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, a few others. And there's very strong pressure on those countries to come forward soon with their numbers, and I'm pretty confident that we will have all of the major economies with their numbers. There's been some misimpression, I think, that it's an obligation on parties to table INDCs. It's not. Actually, there's an invitation to parties to do that. It may well be an obligation to have a nationally determined contribution to be a party to the agreement that comes out of Paris. But there'd probably be some flexibility there for the poorer countries. But I think what we need to see is all of the major economies come forward with a quantified or quantifiable mitigation contribution that is at least has an unconditional component to it. Some of the developing countries have said, well, this is what we can do on our own. This is what we're committing to do. But there's also a conditional component. If we get some additional finance, we can go further. But there needs to be that unconditional component. On the question of metrics and ex ante, it's a little late at this point, right, to be thinking in terms of what kind of ex ante approach you might want in the run-up to Paris. But the issue is quite relevant because there will be subsequent rounds of contributions. So one of the issues that parties will have to grapple with in Paris is how do we frame the process around those subsequent rounds, and the question of ex ante will be part of that. I am very dubious that we would ever get agreement among parties on a systematic process within the UNFCCC to evaluate countries' individual contributions. Joe, you asked the question, who can do more? Well, countries don't want anyone telling them they can do more. They certainly don't want to buy into a multilateral process that's going to tell them you should be doing more. So I think what we need to aim for, and maybe the best we can hope for, are some very clear information requirements. That here's the information you need. I mean, we have that. We started on that with Lima, with setting some expectations. I think those need to be tighter and they need to be required. And that puts everyone in a position, whether you're a government or an academic or a member of civil society, to perform that analysis and put it out there. And I think that is probably going to be far more effective than ever trying to create some system within the process to provide those evaluations, at least in terms of ex ante.
This gets at two real quick questions I want to bring before we open up for discussion about what the process looks like post-Paris, both in terms of, I think there's just a natural inclination to figure out where countries' feet are held to the fire, right? That's sort of the natural tension here is, folks putting their best offering on the table, but also figuring out how people are held to both what they've committed, but also drive them to commit more. There's two ideas in this. One is sort of that 5-year time frame, the 5-year review time frame, and what ex ante, ex post sort of reviews will happen around that. Is the 5-year time frame going to be adequate in terms of having the appropriate level of ambition? I think one of the things we've found ourselves in since 2007 is this strange period where almost every year there's been a end of the year big thing happening within the UNFCCC process, whether you were paying that much attention or not. What will that 5-year increment look like going out? Will it really be about sort of countries sort of working within the big sort of global apparatus to improve their policies and put them in place and sort of assess them? How will that 5-year period look in your mind? And then two, what's required of that from a legal perspective? After watching sort of the Iran negotiations deal go through Congress here, you get the sense that there is a desire for the U.S. Congress to have a perspective on whether or not we need or they will approve sort of the legal part of this deal or what the legal apparatus will be. What is your sense of how that part is shaping up? Did it come up in any of the INDCs? What might be required for making that sort of pledge and review process actionable going forward?
You deferring to me on the legal question? Okay. I'm no lawyer. I don't know that any of the INDCs speak directly to the legal issues, but certainly, there's been lots of discussion around the legal character of the regime, and really what that boils down to is what pieces of it are legally binding. The expectation was set back in Durban that the outcome be a legal agreement. We have the convention, a legal agreement. We have Kyoto, a legal agreement. Some had hoped that Copenhagen would produce one, and it didn't. So this is a big reach to produce a truly legal agreement. The view that came out of the negotiators' dialogue that we convened, and I think this is fairly broadly shared, is that at a minimum, the agreement needs to establish a set of binding procedural commitments. You will be bound to put forward a nationally determined contribution and to maintain that. You will be bound to report on your progress in implementing that and be subject to whatever accountability procedures are established. You'll be bound to come back in 5 years and consider updating that INDC. The real question is whether you will be bound to actually achieve or implement that target. We heard very divergent views within our dialogue discussions. And the report from the co-chairs doesn't explicitly come down on one side or the other. It almost at times seemed to be a philosophical debate. What you think is most likely to induce participation and ambition. Some feel strongly that if the targets themselves are legally binding, we can have greater confidence that they will be implemented. Others feel just as strongly that requiring countries to bind themselves to those targets will discourage participation and will discourage ambition. If you know that there are legal consequences, you'll come in with a weaker number. What the report from our dialogue says is that in the end, the strength of the agreement really rests on the strength of the transparency and accountability provisions and on countries' political will to implement it. So I think you need to get the legal structure right to help facilitate that political will across countries. We've done some legal analysis in terms of what type of agreement coming out of Paris could be ratified by the U.S. through executive authority, basically the president acting on his own, and what type of agreement would have to go back to the Senate for ratification, recognizing that all of this is being negotiated under a Senate-ratified treaty. That was one of the threshold issues, whether the target itself is considered legally binding. If it's not, there are some other considerations there, but if it's not, then the agreement may well qualify for ratification by executive authority. So I've spoken to that question. Joe, maybe you want to take the first.
So I think the wrinkle with these 5-year reviews is we're going to be starting this off around the time that the Copenhagen commitments are either going to be reached or not. So there'll be a lot of discussion. There's already, discussion about whether or not there should be more ambitious interim, in the interim, more ambition in the Copenhagen commitments. There's certainly some, especially the least developed countries and some of the island states have been pushing that with, I think, not much in terms of results. But there will certainly be this task of assessing in the interim the performance in reaching the INDCs, as well as, I think, looking back and seeing what the performance has been for Copenhagen. And in part because, I think there are those who look at what is the emerging architecture under the Durban platform and recognize the seeds for this were sown in Copenhagen. That the kind of political agreement in the Copenhagen Accord, what was then elaborated in more detail the subsequent year in Cancun, is this kind of pledge and review process. And I think that the challenge is that we've got a lot of experience doing something that looks like a pledge, whether you call it a pledge or what was the awful acronym in the 90s, the KELRO, which was the target, QELRO.
Quantified emission limitation reduction objective.
Yes. So we knew how to put a target on the table. We've seen sort of the evolution of these targets into the term commitments and then contributions. Called whatever you want to call it, they're pledges. The review part of pledge and review, we don't have as much experience with. It was an issue, the transparency issue was a key part for the negotiators in Copenhagen. It was an important issue for President Obama. I mean, he personally negotiated with several of his counterparts the language that became international consultations and analysis that developing countries go through, which is just now getting ramped up. But I think that the key thing is, how do we design review? Both this kind of interim review, how do we think about, as Elliot alluded to, this sort of structure for ex-ante review in the future? Because as he noted, the window for ex-ante review in the run-up to Paris is basically shut. But it's something that, as we go forward in time, what will be ex-ante review for the next round will likely be informed in part by ex-post or interim review of a previous pledge or set of pledges. So I think it's the challenge, and when we look at the future of what to expect out of these 5-year reviews, is really what are we going to design in terms of the institutions that produce the information, that produce the analysis. I mean, it wasn't an accident that we wound up with international consultations and analysis. There were alternatives that did not include the word analysis that President Obama personally rejected. He wanted there to be analysis. It wasn't just going to be a reporting mechanism. We needed to have some kind of analysis of what countries are putting on the table. The term consultations was appealing because it sort of echoed Article 4 consultations under the IMF, where you have this process of experts working with people in country. They produce a report. It then feeds into a facilitative peer review process. So like that as sort of the gold standard. Now, as we've implemented it, that's a little different than I think what some people would like to have seen. But I think the key thing is really trying to elaborate what we think the review process will look like, what the information requirements will be, what the institutional design of that will be. And that's going to really then shape what these interim reviews will look like.
Tellingly, that ICA, International Consultations and Analysis, doesn't include the word review, which developing countries don't like, whereas the parallel process established for developed countries is IAR, International Assessment and Review. So we need to get past that. But just one point on the 5-year time frame. There'll be a process of review of individual performance. There will be some kind of collective stock taking. Where are we collectively versus our long-term goal? And then there'll be a period to update or to put forward new contributions. What's really critical is that everybody be doing that at the same time. You need to be creating a political moment where everybody's expected to re-up the pledge process, and that the time frames not be staggered or differentiated in some way. We need everybody to come together, and for all of us to be looking at that, say, okay, what do you each bring back to the table this time? I mean, effectively, what we're creating here is a system of institutionalized peer pressure. So creating those periodic political moments is really key.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's good to know that INDC isn't the worst acronym we've had for the pledging process. We've reached time, but we started late, so I'm going to take one quick round of 3 questions. So Lisa, Tim, and Bill. Wait for the mic and just there you go. If you could just identify yourself.
Oh, sure.
Question, form of question.
Lisa Friedman from Climate Wire. Thank you. This was really great and eye-opening to see how complicated it's going to be to assess and understand how to compare all of these. But I actually have a sort of negotiations process question for you, Elliot. You were talking about how at a high level there's sort of a growing political convergence on some important issues. When I talked to a couple diplomats after this last Bonn session, a common comment that I heard from people was, yeah, ministers are agreeing. I wish they would tell their negotiators. And so I'm wondering if that's accurate. Are you seeing that too? Where are some of the sort of important places and maybe worrisome places where there's agreement at a high level that hasn't trickled down yet? If I could ask a related question, if heads of state indeed come on the first day as the French want, instead of sort of the chaos at the end that we saw in Paris, what does that mean? Is that helpful, not helpful? How do you see that playing out?
Timothy Chung with Clearview Energy Partners. Mr. Aldy, you mentioned the word uncertainty at the beginning of your presentation. I guess from the perspective as an investor or a corporate strategist, I might not like that word. Some may. I guess going into Paris and just into the post-Paris regime, how would you be thinking as an investor or as a corporate strategist, whether I'm a hedge fund or an oil company or a solar company? Thank you.
Hi, Bill Eichord, business consultant. I wanted to drill down just a little bit more, Elliot. In your slide, you had 8 countries, I think, had agreed contingent on financing or market mechanisms. If you could say a little bit more about the market mechanism piece of that, and given the history of kind of how some of the trading schemes and things like that have gone, the difficulty of putting in a specific time frame analysis to show compliance.
So on the lack of evidence thus far that the consensus emerging at the political level is trickling down to the negotiations, it's hard to know exactly what's going on there. It's possible that countries are talking 2 different games at 2 different levels. It's possible that the ministers have passed instructions along to the negotiators that they're just a little slow in picking up on. I mean, the negotiators like to think they control this process, and sometimes I think resent having the ministers get in the way.
They resented when presidents got in the way in Copenhagen.
That's right, yeah. So, I mean, what I take heart in is that we are seeing this emerging consensus at the political level, whereas in the past, for instance, in the run-up to Copenhagen, we didn't see that. There wasn't any opportunity for it to trickle down. The formal negotiations is a very complex, bizarre process, and very difficult to manage. I think we're at a moment now where it really does need to pivot. I think there was a strong sense of frustration and anxiety last week in Bonn that we're not making the progress we need to make, and some high hopes that the next text produced by the co-chairs will in fact be much more concise and cogent and be a genuine basis for negotiation. I think that'll be, I think the next round will be a truer test of whether the political consensus is actually beginning to inform the negotiations. As far as heads of state, it's really kind of early to know just what role they might be playing. I don't know that the French necessarily want this or are pushing it. I think they're trying to accommodate interest from some parties in having heads of state there. I think people are looking to avoid a Copenhagen scenario, so let's bring them early on. I think that probably works best if the negotiations are going well leading up to Paris, and you can have some degree of confidence that there will be an outcome at the end. I think the presence of heads of state can help strengthen that momentum, inject some new momentum into the final push toward the agreement. I don't think you want to bring heads of state in to negotiate that agreement. I think it's more as a political signal of commitment at that level. On the question about market mechanisms, Mexico is the one country that has made its contribution partly conditional on the existence of market mechanism. They'd like to be able to sell offsets, reductions, and thereby achieve a greater level of reduction. Unlike the Kyoto negotiations, market mechanisms are not central to these negotiations. I think that the agreement may speak to market mechanisms in the very limited sense of saying that those countries that intend to use trading, international trading, to implement their NDCs need to do that with environmental integrity, need to show that there's no double counting going on, and the agreement may initiate a process to develop some standards to help ensure that. So I think it's going to come in primarily through the accounting door. I wouldn't expect the agreement to be establishing any new international market mechanisms, but try to accommodate the interest of those countries that want to do it while ensuring that the environment's taken care of there.
Joe, you want to put your hedge fund hat on?
Sure. So on the issue of uncertainty, there's a lot of uncertainty when we think about climate policy, and I think a lot of uncertainty about the efficacy of different kinds of policies one could implement to reduce emissions. Having said that, I think that the process by which we're providing more information now than what we did in past processes. So I referenced how it was only about a month and a half before Kyoto that the U.S. even put on the table its target, which was much better than in 2009, where it was the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, before Copenhagen. So it was about, I guess that was about a week and a half before Copenhagen began. We announced what our target was going in, and of course it was this crazy formulation. I'm not in the government anymore, I can say that. In the range of 17%. Contingent on legislative action or something like that. And it was a couple of days later, China announced their carbon intensity target, and about 3 days after that, India announced theirs. So you had all these targets coming forward, the very last one in the negotiations, but with no details on how countries were going to implement them. And I think the fact that you have in the INDCs where countries are describing how they're going to do their emissions accounting, talk about what's covered by their target, in a number of cases describing the kinds of policies that they're going to be implementing to achieve that, I think helps reduce some of this uncertainty that's going to matter to those in the business community, those in the investment community, because they're starting to get a better sense, I think, of the connection between what's being agreed to in international arenas and what's going to be the domestic program in the countries in which they operate. So I think that's really important, and I think as we start to build up the institutions of transparency, that will help further address concerns they may have about uncertainty. I will also just make a final note, which is businesses live with uncertainty. You're successful if you're able to make investments that thrive even if you realize unexpected or what were previously thought of as uncertain outcomes. And so the thing is just how do we sort of design a process that while may be characterized by uncertainty, still has some predictability about it. And I think having this kind of institutionalized review mechanism, having interim progress, having countries describing in detail what they're doing, I think can help reduce the uncertainty and help make more predictable what the policy landscape looks like for those who are making business and investment decisions.
Well, thank you very much, Joe and Elliot, for being here today. I just wanted to let everybody know we're going to have this webcast along with the presentations and links to some of the reports that you guys have been putting out available on the website, in addition to a podcast interview that we're going to be recording right after this. We hope you'll all continue to pay attention. We're going to do a few more events, both in the lead up to Paris and then sort of post-Paris framework and thinking about the important issue of climate change and how we're grappling with it, both in terms of the international negotiations, but the on-the-ground sort of market impacts and policy issues, et cetera. So thanks very much, guys, for being here today.